little bit about war. You know, when George Bush went to Iraq, you know, he justified it. He said they're weapons of mass destruction. And eventually they got their target. Saddam Hussein was removed. But the means they employed, a lot of people objected to it. They said, you know, this is not the right thing to do. You don't need to send a whole army. You don't need a war. Now, leaders can justify all kinds of actions.
Okay.
You know, they can say it's for the common good.
Right. So this is exactly. So the Mahabharata has an answer, and so let's come back to the epic. So 13 years have gone by. The Pandavas come back to reclaim their kingdom, and Duryodhana refuses. And there are peace negotiations. And the Pandavas finally, Yudhishthira says, okay, don't give us back our share, just give us 5 villages for our 5 brothers. But Duryodhana, again, is adamant. So you can see the war becomes inevitable, and the Pandavas declare war. And on the first day of the war, you know that famous scene in the Bhagavad Gita. By the way, the Bhagavad Gita was inserted into the Mahabharata about 100 AD. And I was telling you the influence. Now the Vaishnav influence began about 100 BC. So it is a product of that Vaishnav influence, because in the early epic, Krishna, who will now be a player in a few seconds, was in the first epic, he's just a friend of the Pandavas. In the second epic, which is called Bharata, he is actually a god with a small g. He's Vasudeva. He's like Indra, you know. But when the Vaishnavas take charge and they have the influence on the epic, then he becomes God with a capital G. So, it's inserted in book 5 of the epic, the Bhishma Parva, and on the first day of the epic, the first day of the war, Arjuna, who's the commander-in-chief of the Pandavas, sees the armies arrayed before him, and he says to Krishna, his charioteer, that take me to a high spot where I can see both sides. And there he sees his uncles, his elders, his grandfather, his teacher, people he played ball with. And he says, I'm going to have to kill them. And so I don't want to fight. And Krishna, the charioteer, has the unenviable task of convincing him through 700 fratricidal verses to go and kill in a war. Now, Indians have debated for a long time who was right, Arjuna or Krishna. Of course, we always come on the side of Krishna, mainly because he's God. But even Arjuna is not convinced by Krishna's arguments until Krishna has to show him his godly form in book 12. This particular debate has assumed an important dimension. Anytime there's a conference on disarmament and war, this episode is brought out. And I was invited a few years ago to the Pentagon to speak about India. And one general brought up this. And I asked him, I said, what do you think? Who's right? He says, of course Krishna is right. This man, we've invested in him, meaning Arjuna. We sent him to West Point. He can't
give up on us.
He can't just, it's like Eisenhower saying the night before the Normandy landings to his driver that I don't want to fight. You know? But you see, the general did not understand one thing. That Arjuna is not just the commander. He's also a political leader. he was part of the war cabinet the night before when they declared war. And so, for me, what this episode illustrates is that we want our political leaders to think like Arjuna also. I mean, they may take us to war eventually, but we want them to consider the moral dimension of their decisions. Now, Mr. Bush took you to a war in Iraq a few years ago, and there was, I'm sure, the night before, there was a war cabinet meeting, and there was Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rumsfeld, Mr. Wolfowitz, all these very distinguished members of the cabinet, and they must have discussed the economic consequences of the war, the political consequences, the war, oil in Iraq, Israel, and so on. But I bet you, no one said, tomorrow we are going to fight and we're going to kill lots of people, and many of those who will die will be our own people. And they may eventually, whatever his reasons in the case of Iraq, but the fact is that this episode in the Mahabharata is illustrating the fact that we also want them to consider this point.
So at the end of the day, Arjuna wanted to fulfill his dharma.
Yeah.
And that's why he went to war, because it was for a bigger purpose.
Yeah.
You also give a beautiful example of Truman bombing Hiroshima.
Yeah.
And the justification was, millions of people died, but, he stopped the war. So I guess he stopped the bombing only after he saw pictures? I mean, I didn't know that story.
Yeah, no, that's true. That after he saw the pictures from... They were planning more bombs. After Nagasaki, they had a plan for another bomb. But he saw the pictures that came in. And he changed. But I think here, yes, Krishna's argument is, to him, the ends justify the means, that having Duryodhan and the Kauravas ruling the world would be like having Hitler ruling the world. I mean, most of us would agree the Second World War was a just war from the point of view of Dharma Yuddha, as the Mahabharata would say, if you are a Pandava. And the concept for us that what if the Kauravas had won this war? It's inconceivable.
It's like the Nazis.
Yes.
The Nazis taken over. I mean,
exactly.
They hadn't been stopped.
It's too horrendous to even imagine. And so that's what Krishna's argument is. The ends justify the means. But I think for a minute, Arjuna makes us stop and realize that means are also important. And in the Mahabharata, there's a lot of discussion of means. Because, as you know, Krishna plays all kinds of tricks in the Mahabharata. All the generals of the Kauravas are killed through underhand means. And the epic gets very angry each time. I mean, when Yudhishthira lies in order to have Drona killed, the fact is his chariot drops down on the ground. He's always traveled, because he's dharma, it's always traveled slightly above the ground. And so the Mahabharata itself is raising the question. So when you make the statement that can we justify this corruption because of the ends that we may achieve, I'm trying to say that it's not a black and white picture, nor is the Mahabharata. You see, this book of mine, nor the Mahabharata, will end up on the self-help section of the bookstore. In fact, a woman actually came to me and she said, I went to the bookstore to get my money back. She said, I bought your book, and then I went to Bahari and Sons in Khan Market, and he would not give me my money back. So I said, what was the problem? She said, I thought this book was going to teach me how to be good. Now, I think that's very, very important, that it's not between good and bad, but the fact that it is difficult to be good. And dharma, Yudhishthira is still looking for dharma at the end of the epic.
Now, tell me, you've become an expert